Hi, my name is Muriel Wang, and I'm a recent graduate of Yale and a former Hemispheres teacher. I'm really excited today to be sharing with you a little bit about the pandemic election. In other words, how the institution of the democratic election has been affected and will continue to be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we as voters should be looking out for in these critical times in order to preserve the democracies we see around the world. So to begin, what really is a free and fair election? As some of you may already know, it's a pretty foundational component of political freedom. Elections and other political processes are really pivotal to the quality of a country's governance. Elections and how freely and fairly they're held could either greatly advance or majorly set back a country's long-term democratic development. What we concretely mean by a free and fair election is that these credible elections need to be transparent, inclusive, and accountable, and that different political parties and candidates should have equitable opportunities to participate in and compete in these elections. Only then can these elections reflect the free expression of the will of the people in terms of who they want to be their leaders and in their government. Of course, there's more to democracy than just free and fair elections, but suffice to say that without elections, it's very hard to have a true democracy. Free and fair elections aren't just black and white. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of nuance. There's a huge spectrum of voter fraud and electoral manipulation that can really change the quality of a free and fair election. Here are some examples of activities and actions that prevent the electoral outcome from truly reflecting the will of the people. These are only 4 of many examples. First, vote buying. That's when the government or different parties give handouts and money and other goods to voters, hoping that they will then vote for them. Or electoral manipulation. That could be tactics like voter migration. The government can move an entire population of people to a new electoral district strategically to make sure that their votes are counted somewhere else. Or it could be setting election days on religious holidays, such that people who observe religious holidays are unable to go to the voting booths and really cast their ballot. The third example I'll bring up is voter intimidation. That is pretty self-explanatory. People are able to threaten and really force people to vote a certain way at the ballot boxes themselves. And lastly, some may tamper with the votes. That would mean misrecording the votes, destroying or invalidating otherwise valid ballot papers, or even tampering with the voting machine itself, such that the machine will only vote for one candidate or one party. As we can see, the institution of the free and fair election is already pretty fragile. There's so many roadblocks and so many ways in which they can be derailed. And now let's add in this pandemic. How does this complicate this process already? On this list, you'll see a list of countries that were supposed to have elections in these coming months. Now they're either confirmed or postponed or canceled until further date. It's all very confusing. As some of you must know, the US presidential primary itself is this November, so that's just in a few months. Countries like Singapore and South Korea have already held elections during this pandemic in the past few months, and there are 58 countries and territories that have already postponed their electoral events due to COVID-19. So how do we make sure that in this time of uncertainty, free and fair elections can continue to be preserved in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Here are some big roadblocks that we're identifying, because free and democratic elections could take place during a certain stage of lockdown, could really happen, but if a ton of people are then infected because of the election during COVID, that is really not worth it, and in fact, it could be very catastrophic. So one example of a big roadblock we see in the new pandemic election would be the case that huge public gatherings cannot be held in the same way as they used to be. So of course, because public events are severely curtailed, you'll see things like campaign rallies, political speeches, debates, fundraising events, public demonstrations, all of these things that we usually see before elections during the campaign period, they're either canceled, cannot be held at all, or they must be held online. Or even if they're held in person, you see a lot of risk of in-person transmission of COVID. Another big example of that is that political candidates may not even be able to undertake door-to-door canvassing. They can't even meet their electorate. This poses a huge issue, especially for new candidates, new political parties, and people who aren't as well known on the scene. They're entering this political scene without in-person interaction. What we see instead is a huge pivot towards digital platforms. So how can we make sure that information about the election, accurate information about the election, accurate information about different candidates can still be shared to voters in an accessible manner, especially to those who may not be digital natives, people who aren't as adept on the internet. How can they still be reached by these candidates to make sure that voter education still remains paramount when we don't have these physical gatherings anymore because of COVID? Another big example of this is that the actual voting process is, of course, very contact intensive. You have to go to a place, meet someone, sign a piece of paper, all of that. So how can we make voting pandemic proof? That seems basically impossible. But countries like South Korea have shown us a model of something we could emulate. In South Korea, which had their votes in April, they did not have a huge surge of cases as a result of an election, which is great. What they had in Korea is that election officials and voting personnel were staffed in all these polling places and very careful. There were temperature checks in addition to ID checks at every single station. And if your temperature was over 99.5 degrees, you were sent to a separate area. In fact, in this top left corner, you'll see photos of people in personal protective equipment, or PPE, because these are voting stations for those who are showing symptoms or are already confirmed to have coronavirus, such that they're also able to vote, but in these very different spaces. In addition to your temperature being taken, masks were compulsory in Korea, and plastic gloves and sanitizer were available at every single polling station. So as a voter, you come in, you wear your mask, you put on your hand sanitizer, you wear vinyl gloves, you keep 1 meter apart, and you must first lower your mask first for ID verification. You receive your paper, you mark your paper, you put your paper in the box, and that's it. But as you can imagine, this requires so many resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of money to make happen. So not every country can have these institutions in place without adequate planning ahead of time and adequate personnel ready to take on this task. Another big roadblock we see is really who gets to vote. Those who are elderly, immunocompromised, confirmed patients of COVID, they all would be either deterred or completely prevented from voting. So although they're eligible voters and their votes should count, there are so many roadblocks to them actually voting. One way we see as a way to mitigate this problem is, of course, expanded home voting. Voting from home is obviously the safest way to vote during a pandemic, but not every single state or every single country has the resources and rules to allow for voting by mail. This graph here, you'll see a snapshot of how different US states rank in terms of voting by mail. A state like Michigan, for example, actually sends out absentee mail-in ballots to every single voter automatically, which means you get the choice to do so, even if at first you weren't considering it. That is a really good way of ensuring that people who are not comfortable going to vote in person, especially those who are immunocompromised, are still able to make their vote count during the pandemic. Another big issue to factor in is the racial disparities that come out because of COVID in the US and how that would affect elections. As some of you already know, the disproportionately high prevalence of COVID-19 in many Black and Latinx communities in the US means that the electoral precincts serving them could really be more severely affected than others. Experts have also said that minority voters are less likely to have had experience with absentee mail-in voting processes, and they're also less likely to trust the government to handle their votes properly in the mail. In addition, and actually more seriously, there has been proof as well in terms of research showing that there is racial bias in which ballots are thrown out when there's absentee voting. These are all very serious issues affecting the voter turnout rate in terms of different marginalized groups and the ways in which the voting process, mail-in, disproportionately affects those who are already marginalized in the country. So with all this information, all these roadblocks presented, how can states respond to the institution of voting? First of all, the integrity of in-person voting can still be preserved for those who are able to go and vote in person. What we'll need to do, though, is train a lot of new poll workers and volunteers and staff who are ideally very young and very healthy to make sure that those who are voting in person have the resources necessary to do so. The next big thing, of course, is to expand the institution of voting from home such that people who cannot go vote in person can do so safely from their home. The next thing we want to talk about is voter education. As I mentioned, because of the lack of physical rallies and campaigns and voter education resources in person, a lot of digital tools need to be rolled out. So how do we make sure that those who are not as comfortable with online resources are also able to hear about new candidates, hear about new issues, and engage in the democratic process without the in-person component? We also want to talk about facilitating the right to vote for all. That could be early voting for people who need to do so, absentee voting, of course, and to make sure that there's no discrimination racially, by age, by disability. All of these things need to be considered heavily beforehand. Again, you need a lot of time to make sure that that happens. Lastly, some countries should also be considering postponing their elections. If they do not have the resources available, any election held hastily will not turn out to be a free and fair election. Thus, postponing may be the best option, either until they can get these resources in order or until the pandemic is less dangerous and deadly in their home countries. So with all this said, this is all, there's so many moving pieces. A lot will happen in the next few months that will change the ways in which we view the institution of voting forever. During this pandemic, it is of the utmost importance to preserve free and fair elections, but also very important, and even more important, arguably, to make sure that our voters are safe and taken care of, and they're not risking their lives in order to cast their ballot. The mettle of a country will really be tested during this time as to how well they prepare for this pandemic election and how they choose to protect their citizenry during this pandemic. I hope that all of you keep, an eye on the news to read about these countries that have these elections and really get ready for the US elections and making sure that the US continues to make sure that votes are free and fair in whatever state you're in for those who are able to vote, to monitor those processes and ensure that the pandemic doesn't completely derail our democratic process. Thank you all for listening. And as always, if you have questions, here's our email. Thank you all. Have a good day.